Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
The roast chicken smelled exactly like it always did. Slightly overcooked, heavy with thyme, the skin rubbery instead of crisp. But I sat at that polished oak table as if it were a courtroom, not a dining room, knowing that every bite I took was being silently judged. My mother, Diane, carved with slow, precise strokes, not looking at me, not speaking, just letting the heavy silver knife drag through the bird like it had committed some sin. My sister Lily sat across from me, swirling her wine and trying to keep the peace in that way only younger siblings who never had to fight for love try to do. Pleasant small talk, fake laughter, all while pretending not to notice the glacier of tension between our mother and me. I hadn't planned to come to this dinner. I hadn't planned to set foot in that house again. But 3 weeks earlier, when Lily called me in tears about how Mom really misses you, I made the mistake of giving her the benefit of the doubt. I thought maybe after all this time, things could be different, maybe softer, maybe not good, but survivable. Instead, I got what I always got: polite disdain, fake interest in my job, followed by a well-timed sigh, the old photo albums left out accidentally, open to pictures where I was cropped out or not in them at all. And finally, just as the last plate was cleared, it came. "You've always been the difficult one," she said, not raising her voice, not scolding, just stating it like a fact, like we were discussing the weather or the saltiness of the gravy. She didn't even blink, just looked right at me across the candlelit table, as though she had waited for the moment all night. I should have snapped, should have stood up and listed every moment in childhood she dismissed me, mocked me, controlled me with kindness that always had a price tag. I should have looked her in the eye and asked why Dad always looked at me like he wanted to say something but never did. But instead, I smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a forced one. Just the kind of small, sharp smile that says, "Thank you for reminding me exactly who you are." I stood up slowly, took my coat, kissed Lily on the top of her head, because God knows she didn't ask to be born the favorite, and I walked out. I left early, no argument. No dramatic exit. Just a short, tidy goodbye. Except, of course, I didn't really leave empty-handed. By the front door, beneath the framed cross-stitch that read, "Home is where the heart is," I slipped a plain white envelope onto the antique table our mother never let us touch when we were kids. I didn't say a word about it, didn't explain, didn't label it. But I knew she'd find it the next morning, probably before her first coffee, when the loneliness started creeping in around the edges of her perfect suburban silence. And it's at this point I need to ask you, because maybe you've been here too, sitting across from someone who shares your blood but not your truth. What would you do if the person who raised you only did so with conditions? Would you stay silent to keep the peace that never protected you? Or would you finally, quietly, take the peace away from them? Because that envelope wasn't a letter. It wasn't an apology. It was the truth, printed in my father's handwriting and sealed with everything she thought she had buried. There's something about silence that makes people nervous. They fill it with assumptions, with old narratives. She probably told herself that I had finally grown up, that I had learned to let things go, that I had matured enough to stop holding grudges. What she didn't realize, what she never understood, was that silence can be a blade. It cuts deeper than yelling ever could. And by the time you feel it, the bleeding's already begun. So I drove home with the windows down, letting the cold air slap against my face, remembering the way she looked at me, not with anger, not even disappointment, but with that smug, quiet contempt that says, "You've never been good enough, and you never will be." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel small under her gaze. I didn't feel broken. I felt ready. She had no idea what I had left behind. She had no clue what I had found 2 months earlier in a cardboard box buried at the back of the attic in Dad's old tool shed. She didn't know about the letter he had written, the one she claimed he never got the chance to send. She didn't know about the dates that didn't match, the signatures that didn't line up, the words that didn't sound like him. She didn't know I had compared it to old notes he'd written me in high school, And she sure as hell didn't know I had sent it to a handwriting analyst. She didn't know any of it until the morning after that dinner, when she opened that envelope and saw exactly what I wanted her to see. But that moment, her moment, hadn't come yet. Mine had. Mine was the dinner, the smile, the walking out. Hers was coming, with her coffee, her silence, and the beginning of her unraveling. And all I had to do was wait for the call. The call came just after 7 the next morning, and even though the screen lit up with Lily's name, my gut told me before I answered that it wasn't going to be a casual good morning or a thank you for making the effort to come, and certainly not an apology from Mom passed along secondhand. No, her voice was already cracked before I even said hello, and when I finally did, the only word she managed at first was my name, just Claire, drawn out like a rope pulled tight across a pit, her breath shaking like she'd been crying since dawn. I sat up in bed, no small talk, no pretending this was anything but what it was, and waited. "She's not okay," Lily finally said, which made me laugh, not out loud, but inside, because the idea of Mom being not okay felt absurd in the way a glacier cracking might be absurd, massive, impossible, and always someone else's fault. "She's crying," Lily went on, and now she was trying to find the right words, the ones that didn't sound ridiculous, but still gave her enough room to make this feel like an emergency. She's shaking. She won't let go of the envelope." "Claire, what the hell did you give her?" I swung my legs out of bed slowly, not from exhaustion, but because the weight of this moment required deliberateness. I told her to slow down, to breathe, but also that I wasn't going to apologize for anything I had done, not when I had done it with full clarity, with both eyes wide open and both feet firmly planted in the truth. There was silence on her end, the kind that tells you someone isn't ready for what they already suspect. And when she asked again, softer this time, almost pleading, what was in the envelope, I told her it was a letter, but not from me. "It wasn't mine to write," I said. "It was Dad's." That hit like a body blow. I could hear the change in her breath, the kind of shift that comes not from shock, but from the realization that something fundamental had just tilted under her feet, and she didn't yet know which way was down. "But Dad didn't leave a letter," she said, the way someone repeats a prayer they've always believed, hoping it'll still work. And that's when I told her he did. She just never got to see it. 2 months earlier, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I'd gone back to clear out the old storage shed behind our childhood home, the one Mom always claimed was full of nothing but rust and spider webs, I found a battered metal toolbox, wedged behind a pile of paint cans, duct-taped shut, and labeled old manuals. Inside were 3 plastic bags, each sealed with masking tape, and inside those, a stack of papers so neatly folded they could have been placed there yesterday. But they weren't. The dates told me that much. One of the letters, written in Dad's cramped, looping script, was addressed to me. Another, identical in tone, but sharper in content, was addressed to Mom. The third was unfinished, but clearly meant for Lily. He hadn't died in a sudden accident, like Mom always claimed. He'd had time, maybe not much, maybe only days, but enough to write, enough to tell the truth. Lily didn't speak for a long time after I said that. I could hear her trying to put things together in her head, reshuffling memories to make room for this new, uninvited one. "Why now?" she asked, her voice small. "Why did you wait?" And it was a fair question, because I had waited. I'd had those letters for weeks before I decided to do anything with them. I'd scanned them, read them over and over, even considered burning them more than once, but in the end, I couldn't, because the words inside weren't just some final confession. They were evidence of years of lies, of twisted narratives, of a woman who had rewritten history so thoroughly that even her children had believed it. "I waited," I said slowly, "because timing matters. And because if I had done it any sooner, she would have just called me ungrateful, like always. She would have painted herself as the victim, and you would have believed her. But this way she had to sit alone with it. No one to spin it to, just her and the truth." Lily didn't argue, but I could feel the resistance bubbling under the surface. She didn't want this. Didn't want the version of our mother that I had handed to her, like a cracked mirror after years of being told we lived in a cathedral. But there it was. She keeps saying your name, Lily whispered. She keeps saying, Pa, she never should have seen that. What did it say, Claire? What was in it? But I didn't answer, because some truths aren't just hard. They're earned. And Lily had never earned this one. She had always lived in the house that I had merely survived. Instead, I told her I was fine, that I hoped Mom would be too, eventually, and that if she needed help, she should probably call someone better suited for comfort. Then I hung up, not cruelly, not coldly, just finally. That day, I didn't go to work. I didn't check my email. I didn't clean the kitchen or fold the laundry. I sat with a cup of black coffee and watched the sky turn from slate to gold, and thought about how grief doesn't come when someone dies. It comes when the truth finally stops hiding. And in that silence, broken only by the occasional ring I ignored, I realized something that caught even me off guard. That letter, the one I gave to Mom, wasn't revenge. It was freedom. She just didn't know how to live with it yet. But she would. They both would. There is a particular kind of silence that settles in when you finally stop trying to convince anyone of anything. A kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, exactly, but from exhaustion that has crystallized into clarity. And in the days following that call from Lily, I found myself submerged in that quiet, as if I had stepped outside of my life and was watching the aftershocks from a distance. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly, but I wasn't guilty either. If anything, I felt a strange kind of vacancy, the sort that lingers after you finally clean out a room that's been cluttered for decades. There was more space inside me, but I hadn't figured out yet what to do with it. That morning, I pulled out an old wooden box I kept at the back of my closet, the one I hadn't opened in at least 10 years, and inside it were the fragments of a childhood I had spent most of my adult life trying to forget. Photos, letters, little paper ribbons from elementary school spelling bees I didn't even remember winning. A journal I'd filled with shaky block letters when I was 7, where every other page had been torn out, either by me or someone else. I no longer remembered. And tucked between the pages of a high school yearbook was the thing that made my breath catch. A faded note written in my dad's unmistakable handwriting, folded 3 times, addressed simply to my tough girl. I hadn't thought of that name in years, maybe decades, and seeing it there on that cheap notebook paper suddenly filled me with a grief so sharp and so fast I had to sit down on the floor. It wasn't poetic or soft, this grief. It was ugly and bitter and tasted like metal, like all the words he never got to say poured straight into my mouth at once. The note wasn't long, just a few lines, but it was enough to remind me that at least one person in that house had seen me for who I was. Not who I failed to be. I kept reading it over and over, and every time I did, I remembered another small moment, another wound disguised as discipline. Another time, Mom had tilted her head and smiled that tight smile of hers, and told me, with a voice sweet enough to rot teeth, that I needed to be nicer to Lily, or to be more ladylike, or to stop trying to make everything about me. The words weren't screams, they were suggestions, well-timed comments, delicate observations that stacked up over the years until the very walls of my personality had been reshaped around them. And as I sat there on the carpet, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life that never quite belonged to me, I started mentally cataloging the inventory of scars that don't show up on skin, like the first time I cried in front of my mother and she rolled her eyes instead of holding me, or the way she always introduced me to guests with a disclaimer, "Claire is our spirited one," said with a chuckle that never reached her eyes, or the time she told me, when I was 15 and Dad was in the hospital again, that some girls just invite drama like perfume, and that maybe if I learned to be calmer, more agreeable, I wouldn't feel so alone all the time. I had spent years thinking there was something wrong with me, some defect I couldn't identify, a flaw that made me unlovable in ways that felt fundamental. I had absorbed her version of me like secondhand smoke, And no matter how far I moved or how successful I became, it clung to me in ways I couldn't scrub off. It wasn't until much later, after therapy, after heartbreak, after years of relationships where I picked partners who echoed her, when I finally started to question the narrative I'd been handed like a family heirloom. That letter I found in the tool shed, the one addressed to me, wasn't just words from a dying man. It was a map, a redrawing of the terrain. In it, Dad wrote about how he saw what was happening, how he had always known Diane had a way of bending reality to suit her comfort, and how he regretted not intervening more strongly, not speaking louder, not shielding me more completely. He admitted he was scared of her in ways he hadn't understood until it was too late, and he told me he was proud of me, not for any accomplishments, not for grades or jobs or marriage, but for surviving. That was the word he used. Surviving. He wrote, "You learned to walk through a house made of traps and come out standing. That's more strength than I ever had." And with those words, something inside me finally clicked. Not because they healed me, not because they fixed anything, but because they gave me something I had been starving for my entire life. Validation that I wasn't imagining it, that I wasn't difficult, that I was responding to difficulty, that the fire wasn't inside me, it was around me. I made copies of those letters that week, not just Dad's, but also the one he wrote to Mom and the half-finished one for Lily, and kept them in a locked drawer, not because I didn't trust myself, but because I wanted to make sure they didn't disappear again. I had lived too long in a house where truth was a negotiable currency, and I wasn't going to risk it being bartered away one more time. And it was in that moment, staring at that locked drawer, that the next move came to me, not out of pettiness, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because secrets rot in darkness, and sometimes the only way to clean out the wound is to let it bleed in the open. I didn't know yet how Lily would respond when I told her that there was more, much more, that she didn't know. I didn't know if she would hate me, or defend our mother, or pretend it didn't matter. But I did know one thing. The version of the past we'd all been living in was about to die. And once it did, none of us would ever be able to look at each other the same way again. When Lily showed up at my door unannounced 4 days later, her face pale and drawn like someone who had just seen the kind of ghost that doesn't float or rattle chains, but instead whispers things in the dark that you can never unhear, I wasn't surprised. Not exactly, though I hadn't expected her to come in person, and certainly not so soon. She didn't knock gently the way she used to when we were kids, and she needed help with her math homework. She banged with the side of her fist, firm and fast, like she was afraid she might lose her nerve if she paused long enough to think. I opened the door without asking who it was, because there are certain rhythms you never forget, even if the person behind them has become a stranger in nearly every other way. She pushed past me without saying hello, without commenting on how different my house looked since the last time she'd visited, a rare and reluctant Thanksgiving nearly 7 years ago, and planted herself in the middle of my living room like a woman preparing for battle. But unsure who the enemy really was, I didn't offer her coffee, didn't ask her to sit, didn't break the tension with the kind of surface-level pleasantries that always made her feel more in control. I just waited, and after a few moments of silence so thick it might have drowned us both, she finally turned to face me, her eyes red-rimmed, jaw clenched, voice shaking but purposeful. "What did you mean," she asked slowly, "when you said it wasn't your letter?" And I could tell by the way she asked, carefully like someone testing the depth of ice underfoot, that she already suspected the answer, but needed me to confirm it to make it real, to make the weight of it fully land. So I told her the truth, plainly, without drama, without embellishment. I told her about the toolbox, the plastic bags, the ink that had faded but not disappeared, the unmistakable handwriting that matched every birthday card he'd ever given us, and the way the date on the top corner, only 3 days before the official time of his death, didn't match the story we had always been told. She didn't cry, not right away. She just stood there blinking, like if she could keep her tears at bay long enough, maybe the words I'd said would lose their sharpness and return to the comfortable lies she'd always known. But then I told her the rest. that the letter to Mom wasn't kind, that it didn't paint her as a grieving wife, but as a woman who had twisted his final days into something silent and small, who had edited the narrative to suit her image, and who had, in his own words, erased what didn't fit. And then came the shift. The subtle tremble in her knees, the way her hands went from fists to flat open palms hanging by her sides, like she was surrendering to something invisible. "I always thought it was just you," she whispered. Her voice cracked open in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers locked in the same bedroom during one of Mom's silent punishments. Those days-long stretches where she wouldn't speak to me but kept smiling at Lily like everything was fine. A punishment for something as small as talking back or not folding the towels the way she liked. "I thought you were dramatic. I thought you needed it to be worse than it was." I didn't say anything because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound like gloating, and I wasn't interested in winning. I was interested in clarity. Lily finally sat sinking into my couch like her bones had forgotten how to hold her up, and when she looked at me again, the sister I remembered was finally visible behind her eyes. Not the polished woman our mother had shaped, but the girl who used to sneak extra cookies into my backpack when I got sent to my room without dinner. The girl who once told me, "It's not fair, but you're stronger than me," when we were both too young to understand how deeply that would echo into our future. "She used me," Lily said flatly, like she had just discovered a betrayal so personal she didn't know where to store it in her mind. "She made me part of it." And that was the thing she couldn't reconcile, the truth that hurt more than any letter ever could. Not just that Mom had lied, but that she had used Lily's blind loyalty as a weapon, had molded her into a perfect reflection of obedience while casting me as the problem child, the emotional mess, the girl who never learned to play along. "You were her favorite," I said softly, not to wound, but because the truth needed to breathe. "But only because you didn't challenge her version of the world." She nodded, and it was the kind of nod that breaks something inside a person, the kind you can't take back once it happens. "I thought she was protecting me," she whispered. But she was just protecting herself. I wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, to rebuild the bridge between us that had been eroded by decades of imbalance, but I didn't, because some ruins aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be understood for what they are. And in that moment, Lily didn't need a sister's embrace. She needed space to sit with the weight of her own awakening. So I told her something else, something I hadn't mentioned to anyone yet, not even to myself out loud. "I didn't just give her Dad's letter," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "I made a copy and I gave it to someone else." She looked up, startled, confused. "Who?" "Mrs. Green," I said. "The neighbor, the one who always walked Mom's dog when she was too busy pretending to be fragile. She was Dad's friend too. I told her to hold on to it, just in case." "Just in case what?" "Just in case Mom tries to pretend it never existed." And in that moment, I saw the shift complete itself in Lily's face, the dismantling of a belief system, the unraveling of the story we had both been told. Only she had lived it as gospel, while I had lived it as punishment. Neither of us spoke after that. We just sat there, side by side, the silence stretching between us like an old wound finally allowed to scar instead of fester. And for the first time in years, I felt something new when I looked at my sister. I felt pity because love without truth isn't love at all. It's just a mask. And Lily had worn that mask so long, she didn't even know it was there. But now it was starting to crack. There's something deeply unsettling about watching the world rearrange itself around a truth that has lived too long in the shadows, like watching a house settle after an earthquake when the structure remains upright, but the foundation has shifted so profoundly that nothing inside will ever sit quite right again. And in the days following Lily's visit, I could feel that quiet, persistent trembling in everything I did, from the way I poured my coffee to the sound of my own name when I answered the phone. It was as though some invisible thread that had once kept all the lies tightly wound had snapped, and now they were spilling everywhere, uncontrolled and feral, forcing everyone to look at them whether they were ready or not. Mom didn't call me, which didn't surprise me. Her silence had always been more potent than her words. A sharpened weapon that left no visible wounds but cut all the same. She didn't write either, and I heard from Lily that she hadn't left the house in 3 days, that she had canceled her book club, ignored her church friends, and spent her afternoons sitting at the kitchen table with the letter clutched in her lap like it was some fragile relic that might disappear if she blinked too long. I didn't feel joy in hearing that. What I felt was more complicated, a strange mix of sorrow, relief, and something else I couldn't yet name, something that hummed under my skin like static, as if my nervous system was waiting for the other shoe to drop, even though I was the one who had thrown the first one. What Lily didn't know, and what Mom would never guess, was that the envelope I had left behind that night wasn't the only one. There had been 3. The first was for Mom, of course, and it contained not just the letter from Dad, but a single page I had written myself. A page that didn't accuse or insult or plead for understanding, but simply reminded her that silence is not the same as innocence, and that memory, however distorted by time and ego, cannot undo what was felt, what was survived. I had written in neat print, "You spent your whole life controlling the story, and now I'm giving it back to the one person you couldn't rewrite." I had left no signature. I didn't need to. The second envelope I had delivered in person to Lily's apartment mailbox, though I knew she wouldn't find it until after our conversation. It contained the half-finished letter Dad had written to her, the one that trailed off mid-sentence, as though he had run out of time or courage or both. There were no grand revelations in that letter, no confessions or apologies, but there was something far more dangerous to the narrative we'd all been raised under: tenderness. He had written to her with warmth, with regret, with a kind of clarity that only emerges in the face of finality. He wrote, "You were always such a gentle girl, and I hope you never let her harden you." And that single line, underlined twice, was enough to fracture whatever remained of Lily's image of our mother as the ultimate victim. But it was the third envelope, the one I hadn't told anyone about, the one I kept in the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser, locked away under a pile of old receipts and spare keys, that held the most weight, even if it contained the least. It was addressed to me, in my own handwriting, and it remained sealed, untouched, a relic of a decision I had made before leaving Mom's house that night. Inside it, I had placed a copy of Dad's letter to me, alongside a note I had written during a sleepless night filled with doubts and fear and the overwhelming temptation to burn everything and disappear. In the note, I had written to myself, not as I was in that moment, but as I feared I might become, bitter, vindictive, addicted to the high of being right instead of the peace of being free. I told myself that if after revealing the truth, I began to feel like I had gone too far, or like I had weaponized grief into vengeance, I would open that envelope and let it remind me of who I was trying not to become. But I hadn't opened it, not even once, until now. I sat at my desk with the drawer open, the air heavy around me like it was holding its breath, and I peeled the flap back slowly, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from the strange intimacy of confronting the version of myself I had been so terrified of only weeks earlier. The letter inside was short, the ink slightly smudged from the night I wrote it, and it began simply, "If you're reading this, it means the silence has returned." I read every line, carefully, letting the words wash over me like cold water, reminding me that pain, even when wielded in the name of justice, can still stain you if you don't know when to let it go. And when I reached the end, I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a door slamming shut, but more like a window opening somewhere behind me, letting in the smallest, quietest breath of new air. Then, without giving myself time to overthink it, I stood, walked to the fireplace, and fed the letter to the flames. I didn't watch it burn. I turned away the moment the edges curled, because this story wasn't about fire. It was about what comes after. I don't know if Mom will ever speak to me again, and honestly, I'm not sure it matters. I don't know if Lily will fully forgive me, or if she'll someday find her way back to the version of our family that only existed in her memory. And maybe that's okay too. What I do know is this: the truth, once spoken, can't be taken back. It echoes even in silence. It lingers, reshaping everything around it. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let it stand on its own, without apology, without justification, without needing anyone else to see it the way you do. I didn't write that letter to destroy my mother. I wrote it to stop destroying myself. And now that it's done, now that the story is finally out of my hands, I can live with whatever comes next. Even if what comes next is nothing at all.